people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fucking fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. I'm sure most of you have caught wind of the disappointing news by now. Clarissa Shields' bout with Savannah Marshall on Saturday has been postponed following the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Boxer has officially released a statement that reads, as a mark of respect, the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, the British Boxing Board of Control has made the decision to postpone Saturday's event. Boxer Legacy Shields vs. Marshall. Our sincere thoughts are with His Majesty King Charles III and the royal family during this profoundly somber time. We are working with all parties to provisionally reschedule for Saturday, the 15th of October at the O2 Arena in London. As soon as I caught wind yesterday that the Queen had passed, I knew it was going to affect this event. I knew Saturday's card might end up getting postponed because we more or less already saw a similar situation play out earlier this year involving Floyd Mayweather and his exhibition match with his old sparring partner, Don Moore. It was supposed to go down in Dubai, and a member of the royal family over there in that region of the world had passed ahead of the event, and the period of mourning throughout the nation affected the scheduled event, so they had to move it. And they were able to do it in a jiffy. They relocated the event to Abu Dhabi, and it went through, but I knew when it came to this card and this show, it wouldn't be that easy. Postponing this show and being able to reschedule it would be more difficult than what we saw when it came to Mayweather and Don Moore. Tickets have already been sold. We're only 2 days out from the actual fight. The fighters are on weight. It's unfortunate. It's bad all around. Veteran trainer of Savannah Marshall, reigning WBO middleweight champion Peter Fury said, Savannah Marshall had not eaten for 24 hours. Been nice to announce this earlier. It's on, it's off, etc. Not good for fighters. However, feel for all the fighters and their whole teams. Also, Sky Sports Boxing and Boxer, who have put so much on the line for this to happen. It's provisional. It's a protocol. It's what I expected. It's a question of culture. Their culture versus someone else's. Some feel that the event should have been allowed to go on because other institutions and other places of business, those individuals, they are being allowed to carry on with their jobs. But the boxer's job is to box, and if the boxer don't box, the boxer don't get paid. The whole country hasn't gone into lockdown, you understand. It's not that kind of situation, but sporting events have been called off. They have. So for those whose profession is to engage in sport, you might see how it's an inconvenience. Reigning WBC super featherweight champion Alicia Baumgartner reacted to the news by saying, your ass whooping got postponed. Have fun making weight again, Michaela Mayer. To which Michaela replied, your payday got postponed. Have fun going back to being a broke bitch. No love lost between us two. And there won't be any if, in fact, this event gets pushed back all the way into October. I'm confident that both Michaela Mayer and Alicia Baumgartner will retain the same disdain, the same fire in the belly that they have for each other. Alicia responded to Michaela's comment by saying, model money, something you ain't got. Al Heyman checks this way, boo. Al Heyman? I thought she was with Eddie Hearn. She promoted by Matchroom? Is that a figure of speech? Yeah, I don't really know. What I do know is the entire card is being postponed. And that's unfortunate. Some of the other fighters, the up-and-comers like Karis Artingstall, Lauren Price, Shannon Ryan, Ebony Jones, Virginia Fuchs. You know, those were more or less bring-along fights and developmental fights for those fighters because they are in the very early stages of their careers. Georgia O'Connor, Sarah Liegman, somewhat inconsequential because those really were developmental fights. Fights that are geared towards just getting the fighter some experience, some rounds in the bank. Not as consequential as Mayer versus Baumgartner or Marshall versus Shields. Though overall, every single fighter that was set to fight on this card is equally inconvenienced.
But it's those fighters, the co-main event, the main event.
Remember now that these are champions. These are world champions, titleists, and they perhaps don't have the wiggle room that these unbeaten up-and-comers have because they have to stay on weight. And what they must now do is perform a balancing act between now and October 15th, presumably October 15th, if the show does in fact end up landing on that date. They've got to perform a balancing act of staying on weight and staying sharp.
This delay will affect some fighters more than others.
It will be more of an inconvenience to those who had to struggle a bit to make the weight. They now have to try to perform a balancing act and hold that position for at least the next 4, maybe 5 weeks. So who does that affect the most? That's what you have to ask yourself.
It's really not easy.
Did you hear what Peter Fury said? That Savannah Marshall had not eaten in 24 hours, waiting on the decision as to whether or not the show would go on.
Is the same true for Clarissa Shields, or did she make the weight more comfortably than Savannah?
Because those who are busting at the seams to make the weight will surely be more affected by this delay, this postponement, than those who are not. Those who are not struggling, making the weight comfortably.
It sucks, but that's the situation. There's nothing I can do about it.
In men's middleweight news, ahead of what is to be his upcoming showdown with unbeaten Conor Benn, Eubank expects to be at only 60% strength against Benn. If I'm at 100%, it's a public execution.
Well, you shouldn't be trying to fight welterweights now, should you?
Whether he is humble bragging or simply being honest or both, Eubank made it clear that even at only about half capacity, he would be able to have his way with Conor Benn. The weight, yeah. I'm going to have to get to a weight which I haven't been since I was 18 years old, Eubank said. It's going to be tough, very painful to do. Not being able to put on a certain amount of weight after the weigh-in, the restrictions are fair. They are fair, because you are coming up. I won't be 100% on the night, and you will. Benn retorted straight away, saying,
That screams excuses.
Well, I can't be anything but real, Eubank continued. That's the weight we agreed on.
Listen, if trying to make that weight leaves Chris Eubank Jr. compromised,
If it hinders his ability to fight, hampers his performance, I don't pity him because he really shouldn't be fighting a welterweight that isn't even an established welterweight in the first place. You signed up for this, buddy.
So whatever making that weight does to you is whatever you willfully took on so that you could fight a naturally smaller fighter. You knew what you were doing.
Well, I can't be anything but real, Eubank continued. That's the weight we agreed on. I can't be 100% when I have to go down to a weight I've never been to, and I can't rehydrate fully. I can't be 100%. That's fair, because if I'm 100%, it's a public execution. We can't do that. So I have to be at a disadvantage to make the fight reasonable. Let's be serious.
Oh, maybe you shouldn't be fighting welterweights.
Demetrius Andrade reigned as that division's WBO champion for some time now. Only recently did the title change hands, and Chris seems neither interested in facing a Demetrius Andrade or a Yanibek Alimkhanuly, this division's newly crowned WBO champion. Chris continued, I'll be 60% on the night, and that will be enough to do whatever I want to with you.
If he can't live up to that expectation, if all of this blows up in his face, if it backfires.
Telling you, I don't pity him, because Chris Eubank Jr. is one of several recognizable fighters, recognizable faces in today's middleweight division that has so contributed to its stagnation. The middleweight division historically has been one of the glamour weights, but that's not the case anymore. That's not the case today, and it's because a lot of guys are making a decision to stay away from each other. Chris is one of them.
Listen, Chris has got to go, and if Conor Benn is the one that sends him packing, I'm all right with that.
Chris Eubank Jr. himself says, I am finished if I let Conor Benn beat me.
Well, yeah, I'd say he is. He was never confident enough to share the ring with the Demetrius Andrade.
No, go back, go all the way back. They weren't confident enough to let him go in there with Gennady Golovkin. In more recent years, they weren't confident enough to put him in there with Demetrius Andrade, even though Demetrius had an alphabet title. I'm sure he would have done the fight in the United Kingdom to accommodate Chris Eubank Jr.'s demands, as he does have some value in that country. He didn't feel confident enough for Gennady, didn't feel confident enough for Demetrius. More recently,
This guy wouldn't park his car next to Yanibek Alimkhanuly's.
these would all be uncomfortable situations for Chris Eubank Jr., who doesn't seem to feel comfortable unless he's fighting a naturally smaller man, and the biggest sacrifice that he has to make is trying to make the weight. That's more comfortable for Chris than
taking on somebody his own size.
clearly not comfortable facing world-class fighters, world-class operators in his own division. He's resorted to fighting a naturally smaller man for no other reason than that smaller man's name value, his name's sake.
It's a bit frivolous, isn't it?
No, I cannot come back from a loss, Eubank said in a video interview published by Matchroom Boxing. I am finished if I let Benn beat me in this fight. Yeah, so that's not going to happen. On the other hand, Eubank noted that Benn, 25, can easily bounce back from a loss and that he would still be able to mount a prodigious career. I can't help him, no, Eubank said of potentially coming to Benn's aid in the aftermath of a Eubank win. It's not my job, but he will come back. He's got a lot of potential. I just think he's bitten off more than he can chew at this particular fight. Again, maybe I'm wrong.
When you hear maybes and things like that, the guy appears to you less than confident.
Potentially draining himself to make the contracted weight for this fight. A fighter being drained, well, it severely affects their punch resistance overall. Benn may arrive at the weight feeling invigorated, not having had to cut down to 147 pounds, whereas for Chris, it could be the opposite.
Where one fighter feels stronger from not having to cut weight, one fighter feels weaker.
But I'm not about to play Chris Eubank Jr. the violin because I reiterate, he shouldn't be fighting a fucking welterweight anyway.
This ain't the kind of fight to where if Chris wins, he gets a bunch of fans as a result.
He'll get a handsome price. He'll get a nice payday out of it, as this spectacle, for all of its frivolity, has a lot of marquee value associated with it.
But if he wins, do you shout from the rooftops about it?
You're gonna become a fan of Chris Eubank Jr. because he knocked out a naturally smaller fighter that still had unfinished business as a welterweight, that still had more he needed to prove as a welterweight, let alone a middleweight. If Chris Eubank Jr. knocks him out under these circumstances, all that really proves is that Conor should have never been in the ring with him to begin with.
It's a bit of a lose-lose for Chris Eubank Jr. If he loses the fight, he's finished. But even if he wins,
what is he really proving, and what does that really do for his career?
The sacrifice that he's making, giving up some weight to Benn.
People aren't going to feel sorry for you because you wouldn't have to do that if you were fighting a guy your own size, and the only reason you are doing it is because you're mitigating the risks. There's a big reward attached to fighting this little guy, but you have to make a compromise in order to do it. That's all it is. Nobody's gonna pity you if it goes sideways, and if it doesn't go sideways, you look like a bully.
A guy who can't hack it with world-class fighters.
So he's gotta pick on little guys. Finally, in men's heavyweight news, veteran boxing scribe Steve Bunce stated, "It's really getting boring," in reference to the ongoing talks between Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury, which should be
talks that should now be defunct since they set a 24-hour deadline yesterday.
An impassioned Steve Bunce spoke to Boxing Social on Tyson Fury's next moves, including the potential fight with Anthony Joshua and another rumored opponent in Mahmoud Charr. Bunce, who has covered the sport of boxing at top outlets for decades, first gave his thoughts on the very public nature of negotiations for the Gypsy King to face AJ. Is there a cutoff point for listening to the endless ramblings of everybody involved with this fight? I'm not a big fan of utter secrecy, but I also don't want to go through everything so constantly. It's really getting boring. Is it going to happen? My gut feeling is that this week they've probably come close.
Wait a minute, buddy. The only one who's endlessly rambling is Tyson Fury. It's not Anthony Joshua, and it's not even Eddie Hearn.
So if you're tired of the endless rambling, it must be Tyson Fury's endless rambling, since he's the one who won't shut the fuck up.
And he's the one who made all of this public. He never had to.
I'm not a big fan of utter secrecy, but I also don't want to go through everything so constantly. It's really getting boring. Is it going to happen? My gut feeling is that this week, they've probably come closer this week through conversations that people have had than they've ever been. But coming closer doesn't mean the fight, is close. Have there been forward discussions now? Yes, there have. But we had the fight made last year, remember? So the answer is, I don't know. Emmanuel Charr, isn't the worst guy to fight for a world title, okay? He's not the worst. Manuel Charr is a perfectly okay heavyweight challenger in the grand scheme of things. He wouldn't even make my top 50 bad challengers.
Well, that's because you're real sweet on Tyson Fury.
You are, Buncey. Let's call a spade a spade. The only endless rambling you're addressing is Tyson Fury's endless rambling. Eddie Hearn's not pumping out video after video after video by way of his social media talking about all of this. Anthony Joshua certainly isn't.
You just don't want to say it, even though you do seem annoyed by it. You don't want to hold him accountable.
You say that you don't want to have to go through all of this publicly, but who made the decision to make this public? It wasn't Eddie Hearn. It wasn't Anthony Joshua. It was Tyson Fury. And you don't want to say it.
You say that Manuel Charr is perfectly permissible as an opponent for a world title fight with an athlete, a boxer, a pugilist.
No, he's not. And you'd never let Anthony Joshua, at the height of his popularity, get away with fighting a guy like Manuel Charr. For a perspective, Anthony Joshua boxed Alexander Povetkin, who knocked out Manuel Charr some years ago.
And Anthony did pretty good at the box office with that Povetkin fight, but the same cannot be said for Fury.
At this point, at the level that he's competing, Tyson Fury, in spite of being at the height of his popularity, Fury versus a guy like Manuel Charr, it just ain't box office. That fight's got no sizzle.
You know, Steve Bunce basically said that the media won't call Tyson Fury out for it.
You know what Steve said? Steve said that's the exact amount that will say the Manuel Charr fight shouldn't happen. 0. No one will. You know why? Because you get paid for access. You get paid for your hits. Is it the fight I want to see? Fury versus Charr? Of course it's not. But you know what? I'll fall in line when I hear all of you guys, YouTube boxing media, saying this fight shouldn't happen. When I started in this business, when I was banned by this guy, kicked out by this show, banned by that guy, because that's what I used to say, I was an idiot being banned. An idiot being banned.
Bunce is not known for being critical of Tyson Fury, but even Steve's got to admit that there's not a market for a Fury versus Charr fight.
This accents the unique problem that I talked about in my previous upload, in my previous video, that Tyson Fury versus Manuel Charr, it's just not box office. And short of an Anthony Joshua, short of an Alexander Usyk, how do you justify giving Tyson Fury a big fat fucking purse and putting him on pay-per-view to get it with a guy like Manuel Charr?
You can't do it. I'll go as far as saying that Agit Kabayel is a better opponent option than Manuel Charr.
Because he's an unbeaten guy, though he's flying low on the radar, so he's got about as much name value in the United Kingdom as Manuel Charr. But that's the situation that Tyson Fury's in. He's climbed far too high to go backwards, having boxed Vladimir Klitschko in Dusseldorf.
Deontay Wilder 3 times in America. Dillian White at Wembley.
You will not get the same reaction for Manuel Charr or Agit Kabayel that you got for those fights, but that's where you're at.
And even if the YouTube boxing media reserves their criticisms and holds their tongue,
Even if they hold off on criticizing Tyson Fury for whatever reason,
those fights still ain't box office. Nobody wants them. He'd be better off doing something with the WWE than sharing the ring with those guys.